They laughed at the village boy every day, until he bought the company. The security guard's arm shot out like a steel bar across his chest. "You're not going in there," the guard barked, shoving him back a step. "This is a private building. People like you don't belong here." He didn't move. He didn't shout. He simply reached into his jacket, pulled out a single folded document, and held it up without a word. The guard laughed. Actually laughed, right in his face. "What is this, a joke? Get out before I call the police." 2 more guards jogged over, ready to drag him out by the collar. But then a woman from the front desk, the one who'd worked there for 11 years, glanced at the paper in his hand. Her face went pale. She snatched the phone from her desk and dialed upstairs, her fingers trembling. "Sir, you need to come down here, right now." 90 seconds later, the elevator doors opened, and the CEO of the company himself came rushing out, adjusting his tie, sweat already forming on his forehead. He looked at the man standing at the entrance. Worn shoes, simple clothes, calm eyes, and his whole body went rigid. "It's him," the CIO whispered. By the time the boardroom doors opened on the top floor, every single executive was already on their feet. Not because someone told them to stand, because they had just discovered, in the span of one phone call, that the man they had rejected at a job interview 7 years earlier now legally owned every chair, every desk, every contract, and every one of their salaries. Silence swallowed the room. How does a barefoot village boy, a boy who once begged for scraps of bread, a boy the whole village laughed at, end up owning the very company that threw him out of its lobby like garbage? What happened during the years nobody was watching? And why did the very people who mocked him now look like they were standing in front of their own executioner? Stay close, because this story is not just about money. This is a story about patience so deep it could survive humiliation, about betrayal that almost broke a man, and about a kind of revenge that nobody in that boardroom ever saw coming. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Long before that boardroom, long before the suits and the silence, there was a dusty village tucked between 2 hills where the roads were made of red clay and the roofs were made of rusted tin. In that village lived a boy named Kwame, the youngest son of a widowed mother who sold vegetables at the roadside from sunrise until her knees gave out each evening. Nobody in that village believed Kwame would ever become anything. The other children called him the barefoot boy because his family couldn't afford shoes that lasted more than a season. His teacher, a tired man named Mr. Boateng, once looked at Kwame's torn exercise book and said flatly, in front of the entire class, "Some of you were simply not born for greatness. Accept your fate early, and life will hurt you less." The class laughed. Kwame didn't. He just stared at his hands. Even his own uncle, a man who visited twice a year mostly to eat and complain, told his mother one evening while Kwame listened from behind the curtain, "This boy dreams too much. Dreaming is for people with money to waste. Teach him to farm before he wastes his whole life chasing smoke." But there was one person in that village who saw something different. His name was Papa Nkrumah, an old, half-blind carpenter who lived at the edge of the village and rarely spoke to anyone. Every evening, Kwame would sneak past his workshop just to watch him carve furniture out of raw, ugly wood, turning it slowly into something beautiful. One evening, the old man called out without even looking up from his work, "Boy, come here." Kwame froze, then obeyed. "You watch me every night," Papa Nkrumah said. "Why?" "Because," Kwame said quietly, "you make broken things look like they were never broken." The old man finally looked up, studying him with his cloudy eyes for a long moment. Then he smiled, "A rare thing. That is not wood you're watching me fix, boy. That is you, learning to see what others cannot." From that evening on, Kwame returned to the old carpenter's workshop nearly every single day, sweeping sawdust off the floor in exchange for small lessons. That had nothing to do with wood at all. Wood doesn't fight you because it hates you, Papa Nkrumah told him once, running his calloused fingers along a rough plank. It fights you because it hasn't yet learned that you're not trying to break it. You're trying to reveal it. There's a difference, boy, and most men never learn it in a lifetime. Kwame didn't fully understand these lessons then. He simply absorbed them the way dry earth absorbs the first rain of the season, quietly, completely, without asking why. Years passed. The old man grew sicker, and on the night before he died, with Kwame kneeling beside his mat, holding his frail hand, Papa Nkrumah pulled him close and whispered 6 words into his ear. 6 words so quiet that even the wind outside seemed to pause to listen. Kwame's eyes widened. His breath caught in his throat. We won't tell you those 6 words yet. Not until you understand exactly what they cost him to finally believe. Kwame's childhood was not the kind you see in movies with soft lighting and gentle background music. It was the kind you feel in your stomach. He woke before sunrise every single day, not because he wanted to, but because there were buckets of water to fetch from the stream nearly 2 miles away before school. He walked barefoot on gravel roads that turned to sharp stone paths near the hills, his feet cracked and calloused by age 9. Some mornings, his stomach growled so loudly during class that other children turned around to stare, and he'd press his hand against his belly and pretend he hadn't heard it either. His mother, Amma, worked from 4 in the morning until the sun went down. Her back curved permanently from decades of carrying baskets on her head. She never once complained in front of him, but sometimes, late at night, Kwame would hear her crying softly behind the thin curtain that separated their one-room home, whispering prayers for a life she couldn't give her son. His father had left when Kwame was 5, chasing a job in the city that turned into chasing another woman instead. Kwame grew up with a father-shaped hole in his chest that he learned to fill with quiet determination instead of bitterness. His only real friend was a boy named Kojo, the son of the village blacksmith. Kojo was loud where Kwame was quiet, reckless where Kwame was careful, but he was loyal. One day, Kojo used to say, punching Kwame lightly on the shoulder as they walked home from school, "You're going to be somebody big. I don't know how, but I feel it." "You're the only one who thinks that," Kwame would reply, managing a small, tired smile. "Then I guess I'm just smarter than everybody else." Kojo would grin. There were nights when the hunger was so sharp that Kwame couldn't fall asleep, and he would lie awake staring at the tin roof, listening to his own stomach twist itself into knots. On those nights, Kojo would sometimes sneak over with half a boiled yam wrapped in a leaf, tapping softly on the window. "My mother thinks I ate too," Kojo would whisper, grinning as he passed it through. "Don't tell her you're the reason I'm always hungry." Kwame never forgot those small kindnesses. He carried them the way other boys carried grudges, quietly, permanently, close to the chest. School was its own battlefield. Kwame's uniform was patched so many times it barely resembled its original color, and the wealthier children in class made sure he knew it. One boy, the son of a local politician, used to flick pebbles at the back of Kwame's neck during lessons and whisper, "Go on, village rat. Answer the teacher's question. Let's see if hunger taught you anything." Kwame always answered correctly. Every single time. And every single time, the boy's smirk would falter just slightly before he found some new way to mock him. There was also the wealthy businessman, Mr. Osei, who owned the largest company in the entire region, a sprawling manufacturing and logistics empire whose trucks rumbled through the village every few weeks, kicking up clouds of dust that made the children cough and cover their faces. Mr. Osei himself rarely visited, but once, during a company charity event in the village square, young Kwame stood at the very back of the crowd, staring at the man in the crisp white suit stepping out of a gleaming black car. "That," Kwame whispered to Kojo, "is what it looks like to matter." Kojo just shrugged. "Or that's just what it looks like to be born lucky." Kwame didn't respond, but something inside him locked onto that image and refused to let go. Kwame studied harder than anyone in his class, borrowing books from neighboring villages, reading by candlelight until his mother scolded him for wasting the little kerosene they had left. And when he finally graduated at the top of his secondary school class, the first person from his family to do so, there was no celebration waiting for him, no party, no pride from the village. Instead, there was another humiliation. At the small graduation gathering, the district officer handed out certificates and gave a short speech about opportunities ahead for the graduating students. When it was Kwame's turn to shake his hand and receive his certificate, the officer glanced at his torn shoes, smirked faintly, and said just loud enough for the front row to hear, "Let's hope paper can do what shoes could not." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Kwame took his certificate, said nothing, and walked back to his seat with his head high and his fists clenched so tightly his nails cut into his palms. That night, lying on his mat, staring at the cracked ceiling, Kwame made a silent vow to himself. Not a vow of anger. A vow of proof. He would prove every single one of them wrong, even if it took his entire life. With his certificate in hand and barely enough money for the bus fare, Kwame traveled 2 full days to reach the city where Mr. Osei's company headquarters stood, a towering glass building that seemed to touch the clouds themselves. He had heard the company was hiring junior clerks, and he believed, with the innocent hope of a boy who had never been given a real chance, that his grades would finally speak louder than his poverty. He waited outside the building from 6 in the morning, sharing the pavement with pigeons and street vendors, clutching his certificate like it was a sacred object. When he was finally called in for the interview, 3 well-dressed managers sat across the table from him, barely glancing up from their papers. "Where did you attend school?" one asked, already sounding bored. Kwame answered proudly. The manager exchanged a look with his colleague and let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Never heard of it. Honestly, is this even accredited?" "You don't have any relevant experience," the second manager added flatly, flipping through his single-page resume as if searching for something worth reading. "No connections, no polish. Frankly, I'm not sure why you were even scheduled for an interview." "I just need one chance," Kwame said, his voice steady despite the humiliation crawling up his neck. "I'll work harder than anyone you've ever hired." The third manager, a heavy-set man with a gold watch, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Son, companies like ours don't run on hard work from village boys. They run on results, timing, and the right background. You have none of those." He gestured toward the door with a lazy flick of his gold watch. "Do yourself a favor. Go back to wherever you came from. Some doors simply aren't meant for people like you, no matter how hard you knock." The room went quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Kwame felt something inside his chest crack, quietly, like a bone under pressure. He wanted to argue. He wanted to list every night he'd studied by candlelight, every mile he'd walked with bleeding feet, every sacrifice his mother had made just so he could sit in this chair for 4 humiliating minutes. But he said nothing. He simply nodded once, stood up, and walked toward the door with his back straight, even as his legs felt like they might give out beneath him. Kwame was escorted out by security minutes later. The same lobby, the same guards, years before that future moment when those same walls would belong to him. Back then, they threw him out like he was nothing, laughing among themselves as the glass doors closed behind him. He sat on the curb outside the building for nearly an hour, staring blankly at his own reflection in a puddle, his certificate now feeling like a worthless piece of paper in his trembling hands. For the first time in his life, Kwame considered giving up completely. Maybe his uncle was right. Maybe Mr. Boateng was right. Maybe some people really weren't born for greatness. That's when an old, weathered man sitting beside him on the curb, a stranger he had never seen before, spoke without even looking at him. "You look like a man who just got his first real lesson." Kwame didn't answer. "They didn't reject you because you're not good enough," the stranger continued, sipping something from a chipped cup. "They rejected you because you were standing in the wrong doorway, asking the wrong people for permission." Kwame turned to look at him properly for the first time. What am I supposed to do instead? The stranger reached into his coat and pulled out a slightly crumpled envelope, sliding it across the pavement toward him. There's a ticket in there, a training program overseas, logistics and trade, fully sponsored. One spot left because the last student backed out this morning. I run the sponsorship fund. Something told me to walk past this building today instead of my usual route. Kwame stared at the envelope like it might disappear if he blinked. One opportunity, the stranger said, standing up and brushing off his coat. One ticket, one lesson, if you're willing to actually learn it. What you do with it after that is entirely up to you. That single decision, reaching down, picking up that envelope with hands that hadn't stopped shaking, would send Kwame thousands of miles away from everything he had ever known, and begin a journey that nobody back in his tiny village could have possibly imagined. If you're still watching up to now, type "I'm still here" in the comments section. The overseas training program was brutal in ways Kwame never expected. The classrooms were filled with students from wealthy families who had grown up with tutors and private schools, casually discussing business concepts Kwame had never even heard the names of. He often stayed up past midnight in his cramped shared apartment, rereading textbooks 3 times just to keep up, his eyes burning from exhaustion. "You don't belong in advanced trade strategy," one classmate told him bluntly during a group project. "Maybe try the beginner track instead." Kwame simply nodded, said nothing, and outworked every single person who doubted him. He graduated near the top of his cohort, but graduating didn't guarantee success. It only guaranteed him the right to keep failing over and over in bigger and more painful ways. His first business, a small import trading venture, collapsed within 8 months when a supplier scammed him out of nearly everything he'd saved. He remembered sitting alone in his tiny rented room that night, staring at his empty bank statement, whispering to himself, "Maybe they were right about me." His second attempt, a logistics consulting service, actually started gaining traction until his own business partner, a man he trusted like a brother, quietly drained their shared account and disappeared overseas, leaving Kwame to face furious clients and crushing debt alone. "How could you let this happen?" one client screamed at him over the phone. "You're just like every other fraud who talks big and delivers nothing." Kwame sat in silence after that call for nearly an hour, his hands shaking, genuinely questioning whether he was cut out for any of this. He called his mother that night, his voice breaking for the first time in years. "Mama, I think I failed. I think I should just come home." There was a long pause on the line before Amma spoke, her voice soft but unshakably firm. "Kwame, do you remember what Papa Nkrumah used to say about broken wood?" Kwame swallowed hard. "That it isn't broken. It just hasn't been shaped yet." "Then stop asking me if you should come home," his mother said gently, "and start asking yourself what shape you're becoming." He didn't go home. He slept in an apartment so small he could touch both walls with his arms outstretched. He ate the same cheap meal 3 times a day for months just to save enough capital to try again. He was betrayed twice more by people he trusted. Once by an investor who stole his business plan and launched a competing company almost overnight, and once by an old friend from the training program who spread rumors that nearly destroyed his reputation before it even began. "He's a fraud," the rumor said, passed from mouth to mouth at every industry event Kwame tried to attend. He borrowed his ideas. He borrowed his numbers. Don't trust anything he shows you. Doors that had barely started to open slammed shut again, one after another, until Kwame found himself sitting outside a locked office building at midnight, having just been turned away from a meeting he had waited 3 months to secure. He called Kojo that night, his voice hollow. "I think I built my whole life on a lie, I told myself," he admitted. "Maybe I really am just a village boy who got lucky enough to leave. Or maybe," Kojo said quietly, "you're a village boy who hasn't finished yet. There's a difference, Kwame. Don't confuse the middle of a story for its ending." There was a stretch of nearly 5 months where Kwame earned almost nothing. He sold his only decent jacket to cover rent. He walked instead of taking the bus. just like he had walked barefoot to school as a boy, except now the streets were foreign and cold, and nobody there knew his name at all. Some nights he stood outside restaurant windows, watching wealthy families eat without a second thought about the cost, and he would press his hand against the cold glass and whisper to himself the same thing, over and over, like a prayer. Not yet, not like this, not the end. Each time something in him wanted to quit completely, and each time he remembered the old carpenter's cloudy eyes and the 6 whispered words he still didn't fully understand. Slowly, painfully slowly, things began to shift. His 4th venture, a small logistics brokerage connecting overlooked rural suppliers with international buyers, found a niche nobody else had bothered to serve. He noticed something the bigger companies never bothered to see, that small farmers and rural manufacturers back home were being cheated out of fair prices, simply because no one had built them a reliable bridge to the wider world. Kwame built that bridge himself, one difficult contract at a time, one sleepless night at a time. He worked with the same discipline that once got him mocked for studying too hard, the same quiet resilience that got him laughed at for dreaming too big. The first year was slow and uncertain, filled with clients who didn't trust a newcomer with no big name behind him. But Kwame kept every promise he made, delivered every shipment on time, and answered every phone call personally, even at 3 in the morning. Slowly, quietly, trust began to build. Word spread. Clients doubled, then tripled. A small warehouse became 2 warehouses. 2 employees became 20. For the first time in over a decade, Kwame allowed himself cautiously to hope. Kojo, still back in the village, called him one evening, his voice full of disbelief. "Kwame, people here are saying you're building something real out there. Is it true?" "It's real," Kwame said quietly. "But it's still small, still fragile." "Small compared to what?" Kojo laughed. "Compared to a boy who used to walk 2 miles just for water? Brother, you've already won." But Kwame wasn't chasing winning anymore. Somewhere along the way, exhaustion had burned away his need for revenge, and something steadier had grown in its place. A quiet, unshakable purpose. Meanwhile, back home, a very different story was unfolding. Mr. Osei, the once untouchable owner of that towering company, was aging quickly and making increasingly reckless decisions. He had grown arrogant over decades of success, surrounding himself with executives who told him only what he wanted to hear. Contracts were mismanaged. Warehouses sat half-empty due to poor planning. A younger, hungrier generation of competitors was eating into markets the company once dominated without a fight. Nobody in that gleaming glass building noticed that 2 very different stories, one rising quietly from nothing, one crumbling slowly from the top, were drifting inevitably toward the exact same point on the map. Your heart should be racing right about now, because what happens next changes everything. If you don't want to miss a single second of it, smash that like button right now. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Then, one ordinary Tuesday morning, a single headline shook the business world. "The Osei Group Holdings is officially for sale." Executives inside the company were terrified. Employees whispered nervously in hallways, wondering who would take over, whether their jobs would survive, whether some ruthless billionaire would come in and gut the place for parts. Rumors flew. Analysts speculated. Luxury cars began arriving at the company's underground parking garage days before the official sale meeting. Potential buyers, their lawyers, their assistants, all dressed in the kind of expensive suits that seemed to announce their wealth from a mile away. On the morning of the final sale meeting, the boardroom on the top floor filled with tension so thick you could almost taste it. Executives whispered among themselves, placing bets on which billionaire would walk through those doors. "I heard it's a foreign investment group," one whispered. "No, I heard it's that shipping magnate from the coast," another replied. Then the elevator chimed. The doors slid open, and a man in a simple, well-tailored but modest suit stepped out, carrying a single leather folder under his arm. No entourage, No luxury car parked outside. He had walked the last 2 blocks on foot, the same way he once walked 2 miles for water as a boy. He walked directly into the boardroom and took his seat at the head of the table without announcement, without introduction, without a single word of explanation. For a moment, nobody in the room recognized him. Then, one of the older executives, the same manager who had years earlier mocked his unaccredited school, went completely pale, his mouth falling open. It's him," he whispered to the man beside him. "The boy from the interview, the one we threw out." Whispers rippled violently around the table like a wave crashing through the room. "That's impossible. There's no way he could afford this. This has to be some kind of mistake. He couldn't even get past our front desk 7 years ago," someone hissed from further down the table. "Look at him. He probably borrowed a suit for today." The heavy-set manager with the gold watch, the same one who had once told Kwame that companies like theirs didn't run on hard work from village boys, sat frozen, his face draining of color, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. Kwame simply set his leather folder on the table, opened it without hurry, and slid the signed ownership documents across the polished wood, letting the silence do the talking for him. But there was no mistake. The lawyers confirmed it. The documents were already signed, sealed weeks earlier through his holding company, funded by years of quiet, disciplined growth that nobody in that room had ever bothered to notice happening right under their noses. Kwame, the barefoot village boy. The boy thrown out of this very lobby. The boy told he wasn't born for greatness. Now legally owned every single desk, every chair, every contract, and every paycheck in that building. The same executives who had laughed in his face now sat frozen in their seats, waiting to learn their fate. And instead of revenge, Kwame did something none of them expected. He looked around the silent room slowly, letting his eyes rest for a moment on the manager who once called his degree worthless, and then on the old front desk woman who had once been kind enough to actually check his documents years ago without laughing at him. "I'm not here to punish anyone," Kwame finally said, his voice calm, steady, without a trace of the anger they all expected. "I'm here to rebuild something that started falling apart long before I arrived." He announced, right there in that boardroom, that every current employee would keep their job. Nobody would be fired for the mistakes of leadership above them. He personally offered a quiet, private apology turned opportunity to the very manager who had mocked him years earlier. Not humiliation in return, but a genuine chance to prove himself under new, fairer leadership. Then Kwame did something that made grown executives in that room quietly wipe their eyes. He announced a new community investment fund, based entirely in his home village. One that would build a proper school with real desks and real books, fund clean water systems so no child would ever again walk 2 miles just to drink, and create dozens of new local jobs so families wouldn't have to send their children thousands of miles away just to find opportunity. He also asked, quietly, that the school be named after a man most people in that boardroom had never heard of. A half-blind carpenter who once carved broken wood into something beautiful, and who never lived to see what his 6 whispered words had grown into. One young executive, barely older than Kwame had been the day he was thrown out of that same lobby, raised a hand nervously. "Sir, why are you doing all of this? You could have taken everything. You could have walked away wealthier than any of us will ever be, and no one would have blamed you." Kwame considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Because someone once gave me one chance when I had nothing to offer in return. I'm simply passing that chance forward. That's the only kind of wealth that was ever actually worth chasing." Kojo, watching the announcement later on a shared phone back in the village with half the community crowded around the tiny screen, had tears streaming freely down his face. "He remembered us," he whispered. "He actually remembered us." Kwame's mother, Amma, sat quietly on her old wooden stool outside their small home, listening to a neighbor read the news aloud from a newspaper, her weathered hands pressed against her chest, her eyes glistening with tears she had waited a lifetime to cry. That night, alone in a modest hotel room instead of some grand mansion, Kwame finally allowed himself to remember the 6 words Papa Nkrumah had whispered to him with his final breath all those years ago. Never chase the people who laugh at you. Chase the life they'll never imagine. Kwame closed his eyes, and for the first time in over a decade, he wept. Not from pain, not from anger, but from the pure, overwhelming release of finally understanding. He hadn't succeeded to prove Mr. Boateng wrong. He hadn't built an empire just to humiliate the executives who once threw him out like garbage. He had simply refused to stop shaping himself year after painful year, the exact same way Papa Nkrumah once shaped broken, ugly wood into something worth keeping. The people who once laughed at him weren't evil. They simply couldn't see past what stood right in front of them. Torn shoes, a thin frame, a boy with nothing but a dream too big for his circumstances. But greatness, real greatness, rarely announces itself with fireworks or fanfare. It grows quietly, patiently, in the dark, in cramped apartments and empty bank accounts and humiliating rejections, until one day the entire world has no choice left but to notice. Back in the village, the school bearing Papa Nkrumah's name now stands where a dusty football field once was, its walls painted bright white, its classrooms filled with real desks and real books and children who have never once had to walk 2 miles just to fetch a bucket of water. Kojo, now managing the very first warehouse Kwame built in that region, still tells the children who pass through it the same story, year after year, as if it never grows old to him. There once was a boy, he tells them, who everyone laughed at. And that boy grew up to prove that being laughed at was never the end of his story. It was only ever the beginning of it. So ask yourself honestly, have you ever been underestimated by people who were supposed to believe in you? Have you ever been laughed at for a dream that felt impossible to everyone but you? And if you ever found yourself standing, successful and whole, back in the very place that once rejected you completely, would you choose revenge? Or would you choose, like Kwame did, something far harder and far more powerful than revenge could ever be? If this story touched something in you, subscribe for more unforgettable stories of courage, betrayal, and redemption. Like this video if you believe today's struggles don't define tomorrow's destiny. And share it with someone out there who desperately needs to hear that sometimes the greatest victories in life begin exactly where everyone else can only see failure.